Hi, welcome to episode 10 of the Book of Revelation in our Radical Bible program here. And today we go to the message of the church in Smyrna. So let's jump right into it today and take a look at what Smyrna was in the ancient world and how the message of God through Jesus, through the angel, through the other angel, through John, got to this community in the late first century. So here's Smyrna, the second of the seven cities that we're exploring here. Ephesus over on the coast, but Smyrna is also a port city, as you can see here. It appears inland. We get there inland on this route rather than going all the way around, but it was a major port city. We can see it perhaps a little better here in Google Maps, where you can see current Izmir, which is the ancient Smyrna, on that same location. Ephesus would have been right about down here. Here's Patmos. And of course, nowadays, if we zoom in on it, it's a big bustling city. But in the time of John, it was a bustling city, but not bustling like it is today. So let's take a look at a few aspects of Smyrna in the first century. So as I noted, it was a rival as a port city to Ephesus. It was also an ancient city. Not all these cities were that ancient. Like Ephesus, back to Ionian times, circa 900 BCE. It had been destroyed and rebuilt a couple of times. The population was perhaps 100,000, maybe half the size of Ephesus, but a very large city for the time. We should not compare that to a city of 100,000 today. That made it a major place. Many cities were 10 or 20,000 perhaps. And Jerusalem itself, most estimates, apart from festival seasons, would be about 60,000. So Smyrna was definitely bigger than Jerusalem. It was under Roman control after 133 BCE, and it was a close ally of Rome. And one way to express that was through the temple and cult to Dea Roma, which is Roma personified. And as you can see from this statue, although this statue is not from Smyrna, that statue was destroyed, it's a similar image. So you can see the female personification of Roma that was so important. And Smyrna was the leader of that. So as Ephesus had Artemisius and was a Neokoros, a temple warden to the temple of Artemis there, so Smyrna had the rivalry of being Neokoros, not only to the temple of Dea Roma, but to the cult of the emperor. We talked a little about the imperial cult last time, and it began here in 26 CE. Again, this is not the same as declaring the emperor divine. This is just simply a ritual that acknowledges that the gods have given authority to the emperor, and the standard ritual, among other various ways of celebrating that, was to offer incense to the emperor as a procession went by. And of course, that was a problem for Jews, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. And speaking of Jews, unlike Ephesus, there was a well-established Jewish community, probably since the 2nd century BCE. And it will come up because it's only in this message and the one to the ekklesia at Philadelphia that we hear anything about quote-unquote Jews in the book of Revelation. And that's a controversial thing, so we're going to have to look at what exactly that might mean. So let's jump right in and look at it here, and we'll bring up the text itself. There aren't a lot of Greek issues, Greek language issues here, more cultural context issues. So let's just jump in and see. So to the angel of the church in Smyrna, following the same pattern, I will note just before we get into the details that there may or may not be a chiasm in the entire seven set of messages, but Smyrna and Philadelphia are clearly parallel in many ways. And specifically here as the question of the synagogue of Satan, only in these two places. And words like synagogue or Jews are only used in these two places. So we'll look at the aspect of Philadelphia when we get to that one. But for now, note that Smyrna here is the second one, but is going to be parallel to that. So it's just the attribute of Jesus here is the words of the first and the last who is dead and came to life. So suggesting there's a need to be resurrected here for the ekklesia in Smyrna. So what the risen Jesus knows, and again, that's the pattern here. I know your thlipsis. We saw that in verse 9. That was something that John shared with his audience. So he knows that they're under pressure. In the little book that I used a little bit for the last session on a week in Ephesus, De Silva gives a very good drama of what the pressure would be for someone who claimed to be a Jesus follower amidst the Roman world in these cities to do business and to be accepted. So there would be substantial pressure, and he dramatizes it very, very clearly. So the risen Jesus knows they're suffering this pressure, and poverty here, which may be a metaphor, may not, and notice it's contrasted here, Patokian, with wealth. And as many noted, that philosophers of the time, especially the Stoics and Philo, who was not a Stoic, a Jewish Platonist, used wealth and poverty figuratively, and there's a good question of whether Jesus does in the Gospels, but that'll come up for another series. Certainly in the book of Revelation, John understands wealth literally, that there's the injustice of the wealth that people have that many people don't have. That doesn't mean he can't also be using it metaphorically here. To understand that, we have to know something more about Smyrna. And Smyrna was, as I just noted, a wealthy port city, at least for the elite. Like in any city, then or now, when we talk about a wealthy city, we're of course talking about wealth for a small percentage of the people, not the slaves and working class folks who provide the labor that enables some people to be rich. So when we hear this, what he knows, I know your suffering, your pressure, your affliction, and your poverty, even though we are rich. Here we can take that as, yes, they are materially rich, but he knows that they're suffering poverty because of how they're being treated. And here that comes up in the form of this translation slander of the Greek blasphemia or blasphemy. It's translated slander here rather than blasphemy, because blasphemy suggests in most people's ears a specific insulting of God in some way or saying something against God, whereas slander is not necessarily against God, as is implied here. But it's important to hear it is the same word. It's only used here in Revelation and in chapter 13, the worship of the dragon here, where we hear blasphemous names there, and sometimes it's again uttering haughty and blasphemous words. So there, it's where something representing evil is saying bad things about God. Here, it's where people who say they are Jews and are not, and we'll look at that in a moment, are allegedly slandering or saying bad things to you, which is to say to this ekklesia in Smyrna. What is that? What could that blasphemy be? And what could it mean to say they are Jews and are not? And what could it mean to be a synagogue of Satan? So let's take this one little bit at a time. The Greek word for Jews here, Judaios, only here in its parallel in Revelation. A common word in the Gospel of John, of course, maybe I shouldn't say of course, but most of the uses in the New Testament of Judaioi or Judaios singular are in the Gospel of John. I've written at length and part of a book that raises the question of who the Judaioi were. Here's a copy of that book, so you can see that. And I've argued strenuously that Judaios in John's Gospel means not a Jew, but a Judean, somebody from Judea. And the particular way that the Gospel of John highlights the ideological relationship with geography between Galileans in the south, Samaritans in the middle. Galileans in the north, Samaritans in the middle, and Judeans in the south. Here the issue is in geography. Clearly we're a long way from Judea. We're in Roman Asia. So the idea that this refers to Judeans in the way it could in John's Gospel or elsewhere is probably not the case. At the same time, the English word Jews refers to a concept that we hold in the modern world of people either having an ethnic identity or a religious identity that just carries with them wherever they are. And that could sort of be true in the ancient world, but for the most part, people's ethnic religious identity was connected to place. The Jews obviously had gone through exile and had been scattered, the so-called diaspora, from the Greek meaning to spread seeds around. So they'd been scattered, but that was an unusual form of ethnic identity with place. Other people, of course, were moved around because of famines or wars or other things. But they mostly did not take their old identity into a new place. Either became part of the identity of the new place, or they tried to return to their old place. But Judaioi plural, could be found all around the Mediterranean. So what the right word for them is unclear. We'll just go along with Jews here, with the caution that it doesn't have the same meaning as it would today. But the issue is, say they are Jews and are not, that are a synagogue of Satan. So to understand that, we have to consider at least a little bit of what the status of these people was in the Roman Empire and why. So two things to consider. One is the Roman Empire ideologically was extremely conservative. And I don't mean conservative the way we think in the United States, at least, of a left-right spectrum, and I'm sure in Europe similarly right-wing, where it started in Britain, implies conservative, which often we take to mean against the poor or in favor of the corporate status quo. But in the Roman world, conservative meant literally to conserve. It meant that they understood that life, human life and social life, it tended to deteriorate over time. And so there was a golden age, and almost always in the past, whether of a person's life or of the Roman Empire. And anything that caused unnecessary change, therefore, was suspicious, because change led to decay, and decay led to death or decline. So the idea of a new religion, which is to say a new set of behaviors and thinking in the world, was very suspicious to the Romans. They understood the way to preserve their power was to keep doing things the way the gods had told them to do things, and to keep them doing those things forever. And changes were therefore suspicious. The question was, what about Jesus' followers? Are they quote-unquote Christians? If they are, then they're practicing a new religion, and that's highly suspect to the Romans. But are they Jews who are in a dispute with their fellow Jews? Well, that raises a different question. That would avoid the conservative issue, because Jews had been around, obviously, for a long time, and in later centuries, arguments by people like Philo and between him as a Jewish Platonist and later Christian Platonist would argue about who was older, Plato or Moses, to say who learned from whom. But in any event, Jews got an exception because they were old, but they were not well received. The Romans allowed them not to offer incense to the emperor because they just refused, and they were faced with the issue of either destroying them completely or making an exception. Obviously, in the Jerusalem of the 60s, the coalition that rose up against Rome was destroyed. But that's not a victory for the Romans. That was a defeat, because dead people don't pay taxes and destroyed cities don't serve the empire. So to destroy a city for rebellion is not a sign of victory, but a sign that Rome's control was fragile, and that a city could rebel against it. They couldn't get away with that. They'd have to be destroyed. But again, that was not a sign of Roman strength to destroy them. So the temple had already been destroyed, and the Jews that existed scattered around in the diaspora. And so what does it mean by synagogue of Satan and the Jews who are not? So synagogue, only here in its parallel, from the Greek, meaning to gather together with, in the first century almost certainly didn't refer to a dedicated building any more than ekklesia as church referred to a dedicated building. Rather, it just simply meant where people gather together. It could have been a house or a public space or some other way. So in other words, it refers to the people gathered, not to the physical thing itself. So to call them a synagogue of Satan is to say, of course, that they're serving not the God of the Israelites, Yahweh, but Satan. And so we have to look a little bit at who Satan is. Satan is used several times, you see, in the messages of the churches, and then here and here, where it's equated with the devil. And that's where most Christians assume that the snake in the Garden of Eden here and the devil and Satan are all the same reality. That's in chapter 12, and then the same issue in chapter 20, we see the ancient serpent, devil, and Satan. But it's John's vision that unites those. Historically, they've been separate. Satan is a term that comes from the Persian. The Aramaic actually was the Persian imperial language and meant a royal accuser. It meant somebody who, in the provinces, where, of course, there was no CIA or phone apps to track your movements, had to send secret agents in, basically, to see if the folks in the provinces were fomenting rebellion against the empire. So when Persia controlled the area around Jerusalem, in between the Babylonians and the Greeks for 200 years, from the 500s to the 300s, they would send in Satana in order to check on the locals. And that came out first in the biblical language of the Hebrew scripture, Aramaic or Hebrew, and then in Greek as Satan, the accuser. As opposed to the devil, which comes from the Greek diabolos, which literally means to throw across. Dia, like diameter, is a line across, and balos from to throw. So etymologically, the opposite of diabolic is symbolic. To throw across, which is to say to tear apart, or to throw together, sum as a prefix for unity, so symbolic, to throw together. So either as the devil who throws apart, or as Satan who accuses, the ekklesia here in Smyrna is said to be facing this struggle. So to say people are Jews or are not can mean one of two things here. It can mean people who are totally not Judaioi, who are trying to claim the hiding behind it, the legal exemption hiding behind it, which could mean Gentile Jesus followers who know that as Jesus followers they're in trouble with the Roman Empire, but if they can claim the protection of Jewish identity, they could be safe. Another way to read that is people who are Jews that are not, is to say, from John's perspective, people who are persecuting the followers of Jesus. Which puts this argument in a similar ground with the folks at the Dead Sea, in the Dead Sea town of Qumran, who argued similarly for a long time against the Jerusalem elite as having sold out for their collaboration with Rome. So out of that similar kind of tradition, they're called children of Belial, which is an apocalyptic alternative name for the devil or the evil one. So in that similar sense, the Jews who say they are or not could simply be people who are ethnically and officially Jews, but from the perspective of John's vision are not faithful, and so therefore are not really Jews, in the way that the Catholics and Protestants argued over time, and to this day Christians argue about quote-unquote being a real Christian. So either way, it could be Gentiles who are trying to hide behind Jewish identity, or Jews who are not being Jews in the way that John of Patmos thinks they should be. But they're suffering some kind of identity here, and it almost certainly relates to how much conformity to the Roman Empire is acceptable after they've been baptized. And for some people, like John, it's a radical view, and no compromise at all is allowed, and for others, the question of compromise was always subject to negotiation, as it remains to this day. Nobody can be purely following Jesus in the world where our energy and our clothes and our food and everything else are compromised by all kinds of ways of being that would not be how Jesus would have us live. But we have to live in this world, and so it goes. That's not a reason to quit, and it's not a reason to give up under the pressure. It's a reason to pray harder and to be more devoted to trying to live the way Jesus calls people to live. And so that's where we get the exhortation now, not just the knowledge. So do not be afraid, yet again already, to not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. Curiously, this is the only time the word paschain, from which we get the term paschal mystery to refer to Jesus' own suffering and death, only time it's used here. Suffering is often implied by affliction, thlipsis here, and other terms. It's the only time the term is used here. And he says here, could be beware or pay attention. Remember, we saw earlier that this is a strong word for pay attention, wake up. So be aware, the devil is about to throw some of you in prison. Prison in the Roman world did not mean somewhere where someone was sentenced after they'd committed a crime, but as you can see in Acts of the Apostles, where Paul and Peter and others are sent to prison, where it's a holding place when the officials don't know what to do with you and have to figure out what the next step is, or it could also be for debts and other things like that. But in this case, it's almost certainly implying troublemakers who need to be gotten off the street until the officials can decide what to do with them. And it's described as a test here. Peresthede, which is a common term for test or temptation. As in the Lord's Prayer, do not lead us into temptation or into the time of trial or testing. But that sense of testing, like minerals or rocks refined by fire, is a way of purification. It's in difficult circumstances that people make the decisions that shape their lives and what their witness is. The phrase for 10 days is a standard colloquial phrase for a short period of time. It's not literal time. It would have been understood that way, like we see in Daniel 1:12 here, where in the court tales, Daniel is told to test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables. So again, a conventional way to refer to a short time. It brings back thlipsis here, so we can see the echo. So I know your thlipsis, and you, for a short time, you will have thlipsis. But if you're faithful until death, you will get the crown of life. In Smyrna of the time, the crown of Smyrna was the Agora. And here's an image, at least, of the ruins of the Agora, the main marketplace of Smyrna. In a port city, it's where people gathered, as you can imagine. Here in Seattle, the Pike Place Market and other port areas are often common gathering places, certainly were in earlier days before the internet became a substitute for physical gathering. So the Agora was their crown, and so there's a contrast here, as in many of these locations, between what they knew in the world around them and using that as a metaphor here. Here, in the sense of the crown of life, a wreath usually made out of vegetable material like laurel branches. Here, laurel, myrtle, and ivy was a common one. And common combination, and those would be given to people who won the games, but here in the sense of the struggle to stay faithful, those who are faithful would be given the crown of life. And as always, it ends with anyone who has an ear, listen to what the Spirit is saying, and concludes finally with whoever conquers, again filling out the athletic war image here, will not be harmed by the second death, or literally not be treated unjustly. We'll see how the same phrase is used in the seals in relation to agricultural crops. So we'll explore that more in detail later. But to not be treated unjustly, adikeo, the opposite of dikeo, justice, or to treat justly. So whoever conquers will not be treated unjustly. In other words, they will have a just death and will not be destroyed by the second death, which we'll find out more about near the very end. So that's it for the message of the church at Smyrna, and stay tuned in episode 11, and we'll move on to the ekklesia in Pergamum. See you then. Bye-bye.